Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the English Sovereigns podcast. In today's podcast, I shall be talking about one of England's worst kings, John. If somebody in conversation randomly brought up the name King John, you might think one or even two things about him which might spring to mind. Firstly is the folklore tale of Robin Hood, which I will not be focusing on so much in that, for I looked at it in Richard the Lionheart's. But secondly, and saliently, you might think of the Magna Carta, which was obviously quite a big thing. Before I get on to the main event of John's reign, I'll just give a little bit of background. He was the youngest of King Henry II's son, and as a result was not expected to inherit the throne, or anything really, hence why his nickname is John Lackland, because he literally lacked land. As his time as a prince, he was a fan of backgammon, hunting, jewellery collection, reading, and temperamentally he was quite yin and yang, so he could be capable of quite nice acts of generosity, but also quite large fits of anger, although that was sort of expected of anyone in a sort of leadership kingly role, I suppose. In 1185, Henry II tried to make John the King of Ireland, but Pope Lucius III vetoed it, but it didn't stop John taking the piss out of the long beards of the local Irish lords, and this obviously annoyed the Irish and probably contributed to further sort of animosity towards the Irish, which would endure, as we all well know, until, pretty much maybe even 20 years ago. So that was it. Henry did want John to take on more responsibility, but John was proven to sometimes be a little bit temperamental, as I've just talked about. So in terms of his actual reign, he acceded once he actually betrayed his father publicly, and he immediately signed the Treaty of Le Goulet with Philip of France in May 1200, as Philip had contested John's succession. So John recognised Philip's right as the feudal vassal overlord of John's French territories, because do not forget, William the Conqueror was a vassal of the King of France at the time of the Norman conquest. So technically he was reasserting the legal status quo before the English, England got absorbed in part of a larger empire and actually became arguably just as powerful, if not more powerful, than France. And in exchange, Philip dropped, claiming the throne of England for himself, or at least disputing John's claim in himself. However, John immediately pretty much broke this treaty, as you would probably expect, resulting in a war, and John actually losing the province of Normandy by 1204, as well as Anjou and Poitiers. He only kept Aquitaine. John, as a result, felt like he had lost a lot of prestige, or even if he didn't feel lost a lot of prestige, he was a little bit delusional in thinking that he hadn't, because losing Normandy was a pretty big deal, especially given English kings, or at least kings of England, had seen Normandy as actually their greater kingdom, as almost their power base, as it were. So that wasn't too good, and John, even though he tried to expand the navy and actually increase scutages, which are basically forms of tax to finance local garrisons, the nobles were just not impressed with John. They threatened rebellion on about 3 occasions, I think in 1205 and 1212, to when John wanted to take back Normandy. They said no, because it's going to be a waste of resources, and the times they did try, such as in 1214, it was a failure, and 1214 in itself was the last straw for the barons who actually decided to start rebelling, which they promptly did. They ended up occupying London, which is pretty bad if you're losing your what would basically be your largest city in the empire to a group of rebellious barons. So John was forced to meet the barons at Runnymede, which you might have heard of, on the 15th of June 1215. So this was where the Magna Carta was signed. There were 63 clauses all in all in this Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter, including the granting of taxes, of lands, anything to do with debt, the church, retaining peace, and of course, most infamous, or not most infamous, the most important nowadays because it's still in force, Clause 39, the trial by jury. it's quite important to note that this was only to do with free men, because back then we still had serfs and unfree men. So this only concerned the rights of free men, so a sort of burgeoning class almost. Not really a working class thing. Not that really working class was a term back then, but I think you might know what I mean by that. So John didn't actually intend to abide by this despite signing it. He got Pope Innocent III to invalidate it, which Innocent promptly did, and this triggered quite a full-out war, civil war. It actually went initially quite badly for the barons, but they invited Prince Louis of France to lead them, and they actually won some victories back. And eventually John, I think, was in East Anglia, King's Lynn, which back then was known as Lynn, and contracted dysentery whilst planning to fight back in September 1216. So John's reign ended fairly ignominiously, although it wasn't to say that John was losing that bad. It wasn't like he was retreating really badly and then contracted dysentery. He was planning to fight back. He had not lost that civil war by any means. But John is quite a surprise, really, and I'm almost a little bit torn. I know in previous podcasts I've referred to him as one of the worst kings, and I think in terms of what happened to him personally, he was perhaps one of the worst kings, and it was largely self-inflicted. And he was quite a competent administrator. This is the weird thing about it, because he spent 10 years basically, acting as regent, but in all but name, for Richard during his reign, and had proved himself to be a fairly adept political player during King Henry II's reign, and had experience in Ireland as well, because he was, anointed as King of Ireland or appointed by Henry. So it wasn't as if he hadn't had experience. Maybe perhaps it was Donald Trump, if he's any authority to enunciate upon. He had experience, but it was bad experience. That might be a good way of putting it. I don't know. The Magna Carta would end up being reissued quite a few times by kings who wanted to extract money from Parliament, so it had actually end up being a bit of a trade-off. But John's biggest mistake was, I think, perhaps being a little bit greedy. He could have kept his Angevin territories. He still had a lot of prestige. After the Treaty of just before the Treaty of Les Goulet, he could have kept with being a vassal, but he didn't. So he wanted to be a little bit greedy, and then he ended up basically losing it for the rest of his reign. And the Magna Carta became one of the basis documents for the Bill of Rights, the American Constitution, and liberal democracy all around the world. Although I must make clear that it certainly was not seen as this great liberal democratic surge when it was first issued in 1215. So that is that. He was succeeded by his very young son Henry, who became Henry III, and he will be the subject of episode 29. Thank you very much.